Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It is our October edition of Community Hangout, and that is Caribbean Community Hangout. I am so excited to be hosting, and I'm even more excited to hear what our guests have to say this morning. I am Chriselle Benjamin Jerome from Grenada, whoop whoop, and I am the Communications Officer for the Caribbean team. Today we have Dr. Kanan and Sharice Joseph with us, two individuals who are passionate about sustainability and they've dedicated their career to the cause. Thank you again for joining us, and I will give you both the opportunity to introduce yourself, starting with Sharice.
Oh, hi. So just checking that y'all can hear me correctly.
We can hear you.
Okay, right. Hi, so everybody. My name is Sharice Joseph. As Chriselle said, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you for considering me a subject matter expert. Just to give you some background and give the audience some background as to my involvement in the field. So I consider myself an environmental professional broadly. A lot of what I've dedicated my to call is environmental and social safeguarding, which is basically implementing measures to protect against the unintended effects of development. That would also include sustainable development. I have a bachelor's degree in environmental science and policy, and because I like the field so much, I ended up getting a master's degree in environmental management and policy. And since then, I've accumulated about 14 years of experience in the field in different capacities. I've worked in environmental regulation here in Trinidad and Tobago. I forgot to mention that. I am a born and raised Trinidadian. I'm Tobagonian, but I've also worked in environmental regulation, community engagement, and dabbled a bit in environmental justice and community organization. I currently work as the advisor for disaster risk reduction and environment at the Association of Caribbean States here in Trinidad, but it represents the interests of 35 member states as well. One of the things that I said earlier when we were just chatting was that working in the region, it's impossible to really extricate disaster risk resilience from environmental management just because of the nature, the toxic marriage between the two. So a significant portion of my career has really been dedicated to disaster risk reduction, comprehensive disaster management, and of course, because of those two, climate change being the overwhelming, looming threat that it is to both the environment and to the region, I've ended up working alongside with climate change as well. So that's a broad overview of my background, and I'm happy to meet you all.
Thank you, Sharice. Kanan.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure being here. I am originally from the island of Grenada, like Chriselle, we're representing here. And just to give you some background, originally in the Caribbean, I worked as a journalist for most of my life. Actually, my first job was with the Grenadian Voice newspaper, which is one of Grenada's oldest broadsheet newspaper publications. And I completed my first degree in the Republic of China on Taiwan in international communication, and then proceeded to complete my graduate work in the United Kingdom at the University of Leicester in new media governance and democracy. That particular graduate degree also covered elements of policy work. And I pursued my PhD at Howard University here in the Washington, D.C. area, where I'm currently located. And my area of research focused on understanding and making sense of the health impacts of climate change on African American and other climate justice communities here in the United States. I specifically focused on the climate change burden of asthma to establish the direct correlation between respiratory illnesses and rising temperatures in what we call climate justice communities. So what is a climate justice community? A climate justice community is defined as a community that bear the disproportionate health and socioeconomic burdens of the challenges that are foisted upon them by climate change. These communities also contribute least to fossil fuel emissions but these communities suffer the most in respect of those climate impacts. And of course, when we have to have a conversation about climate change, what my dissertation attempted to do was to make the point that climate change is intersectional. It not only affects the polar bears and the melting ice caps in Antarctica and the Antarctic, but it also affects everyday human lives. And we all impacted by climate change in some way. And sometimes we may not even think about it, but it's there. And so the point of us as communicators, as health communicators, because my concentration was in health communication, is to make sense of these impacts for these communities that suffer those impacts. And so my dissertation was able to conclude that many people understand those impacts, especially through that asthma lens, because what tends to happen because of the erratic changes in the seasons in the United States, people's asthma burdens are also impacted greatly as a result of that. So a lot of these people that I interviewed are actually also in the activist space because of that disproportionate impact that climate change has on them. They decided to get involved in activism as a result of that. So I'm currently an associate professor here at Montgomery College, which is in Rockville, Maryland, right outside of the DC suburbs. And I continue to do work around climate research, climate justice research in particular understanding those burdens that our people are confronted with, marginalized communities, but also people in the global South. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Wow. Between the two of you, I think we can have this hangout the entire day. We don't need to stop. Do you have time?
Yeah.
So thank you both. The topic for discussion today is the impacts of the era of global boiling on the Caribbean. So this topic wasn't chosen by chance, and neither were the words. It's actually borrowed words from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He put it very interesting, didn't he? The era of boiling. So lately, we've been hearing Caribbean residents singing, "I'm feeling hot, hot, hot." And we've had so many extreme heat advisories disseminated throughout the Caribbean region by the meteorological offices. So, what better time is there to discuss the era of boiling and the impact that it has on the Caribbean region than now? So, Kanan, what do you have to say on this topic, the era of boiling and the impacts on the Caribbean region?
Mm-hmm. Well, so the era of boiling, it does make sense. I mean, the reality is this era of boiling has been predicted by the scientists since the early 90s. In fact, at the first intergovernmental panel on climate change, it was actually not even the 90s, it was the late 80s, the very first meeting that they had. They predicted back then, they were calling for there to be a reduction in global emissions because we will get to this point. But we are now in these points. And first of all, we have to appreciate that this is an El Nino year. So what happens in an El Nino year is that parts of the global South tends to be warmer. So that's one of the reasons why we are experiencing that extreme heat. That always comes with an El Nino year. In the Northern Hemisphere, the weather patterns tend to be cooler. But once you throw in the equation of climate change, once you throw in the equation of warmer oceans with regular weather phenomenon like El Nino, which happens every 7 or 8 years, then it creates a very difficult set of circumstances for human and non-human life, as we're witnessing in the Caribbean now. But again, coming from that health communication lens, what are the impacts of this boiling? The impacts of this boiling can be seen through heat strokes. The impact of this boiling can be seen through people experiencing fainting spells and people experiencing severe dehydration. So let us think about or the Caribbean working class who work outside on farms, who own farms, people who do construction on houses, people who do road construction. Now, have we given thoughts to what regulations ought to be in place for these people to protect them from these extreme heat events? Yeah. Do we have regulations for construction workers that says if the heat gets to a particular temperature, that work stops at that point? What about any kind of medical systems do we have in place to confront these particular heat strokes? We are already burdened with extremely challenging health infrastructure in the Caribbean. How ready are we to deal with what is expected to be a point of no return in respect of heat? Okay, so this is what we have. When I think about boiling, that's what I think about. But through the journalistic lens as well, one of the challenges we have in the Caribbean in respect of climate reporting is that climate reporting is not necessarily seen as a sexy topic that can generate likes and views and shares. Yeah, it will not generate those things except if it's a major event like a hurricane. So you cover a hurricane, the media comes in, they cover the impact of the hurricane, they cover the amount of houses destroyed, but then the cameras leave. And citizens of these communities have to then pick up from the destruction, but those impacts continue for decades, for years, for many years. I mean, when we think of Hurricane Katrina as an example, the mental health impacts are still there. It's not a case where the hurricane came and you just move on with your life. There are several things that happens. And now in the context of heat, this is in many respects a slow burn. It's a slow burn for media because people, it's not one of those things that's a flashy event that happens. It's not like a hurricane, it's not like a tornado. The heat is just there. But the impacts, it doesn't mean that because the media is not covering it, that the impacts are not felt. The impacts are felt for farmers. Yep, the impacts are felt for, as I said before, for people who work outside. And the impact is felt for marine life as well. I mean, if you were to follow what's happening in respect of our oceans, the acidification of coral reefs. Within 50 years, many of the coral reefs in the Caribbean may be gone. What are we thinking about in respect of regenerating those reefs? And all of that really is affecting or is part of the boiling that we're seeing in the Caribbean. These are all very nuanced impacts that we don't really talk about, but it's there.
Very nice. Over to you, Sharice. What do
Right,
you have
I
to
was
say?
I was listening so intently because I made some notes as well. Because because what you said, even in my, I don't consider myself old. So even in my lifetime, which in less than 40 years, I've seen the language changing from global warming, greenhouse gas, maybe it's possible, to climate change, to climate crisis. And now we go and now global boiling. The messaging is speeding up for a reason. It's intensifying for a reason because the impacts which have been predicted since, Kanan said, since the 90s, have not been acted upon in a way that would reduce this slow burn. One of the things I noted when you were talking there is that I feel like the messaging is changing to be more intense and more dramatic because people are starting to finally relate. So when you hear about, okay, the oceans are going to rise by a meter, that doesn't click as much as every time it rains, you're not going to be able to get home because it's flooding. Every time it's a little hot, you're literally going to be in a health crisis. Things like that, they're not relatable. So the messaging is really important. So when you're talking about the slow onset, and I'm glad that you mentioned it because a lot of times when you talk about disaster, and especially from a disaster preparedness lens, people tend to prepare for the sudden onset disasters. So hurricanes, inundations, storms, things that can be predicted. And then a lot of the times, unfortunately, the funding tends to go to recovery from those events. But for slow burn events, like you mentioned, the slow onset disasters, there's a lot less action and a lot less awareness of what can be done beforehand to stop those things. So one of the things that I know I've seen focused on more recently is anticipatory action. So not just preparedness, but what do we know is coming? What can we put in place to actually prevent an incident or a risk from turning into a sudden onset or a slow onset disaster? And a good example of that is if you know that a drought is coming because you know a heat wave is coming, what can you implement for your livestock so that you don't lose as much livestock? Because the impact of that is not just going to be the drought, the impact is going to be food stocks for your country. You're going to end up with malnutrition. So it's what do you put in place to prevent what we know is coming from turning into a disaster event down the road. So, and to me, that's why the messaging has really shifted. So global boiling gets something in your mind going. You don't think, okay, it's a little hotter now. It becomes, this is immediate, this is drastic. We need to take action now. And especially for the Caribbean, is something so very important because, as you mentioned, we are disproportionately feeling the effects of climate change. We, as a region, have not contributed as much to what's happening right now, but we're going to be, on the front lines to facing it. So messaging and languaging, it's very important. So when you hear global boiling, I think it's not that the research has changed that much. We've been predicting this for a while. What's happening now is that it's trying to get people to act in a way that is really urgent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So both of you mentioned the messaging. So can I ask, how do we make climate hot in terms of messaging and climate change communication? Pun very much intended, yes.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Trissa. Sure.
No, I was gonna say that it's an unfortunate reality, at least from my lens, working in disaster, that people tend to feel and then relate to it. And sometimes you really do have to get a taste of it to understand what's going to happen. There's no way to make a disaster really sexy. There's no way to make it less dramatic. One of the things I was thinking of recently, and this is an unfortunate comparison, but the way that media and the stories are being told about the Israel-Gaza conflict right now, it has changed. People are able to see the conflict from people's personal lenses because they're seeing what's actually happening. I think the way to probably make it more relatable is that if people tell their stories of what they're actually experiencing during non-events, because what tends to happen is when an event happens, you think, okay, well, it'll happen and then we put recovery. But there are things you can do beforehand. There are things people experience beforehand. So I think to make it more sexy, it's to just make it more relatable, more stories, more understanding that the polar ice cap, as far as it seems, the polar bears, okay, there are people who don't care if animals go extinct. Like I hear daily 50 birds are now extinct, and I'm just like, okay, that doesn't relate to me as much as my 6-year-old daughter cannot study in school because she's so hot. There's no air conditioning. She's coming home sweating, can't concentrate. It's how do you bring those stories?
Okay.
I think we're having some issues there.
I was wondering if it's my
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, can you repeat? I heard your child can't concentrate at school. There's no AC. Okay. Okay, you're gonna switch to internet. Okay.
Yeah, if I can.
And Kanan went out also. All right. Well, we do have some, while Sharice switches her internet, and Sharice, are you back? Okay. Okay, so while Sharice and Kelon tries to rectify what it is that's happening on their side, we do have some conversation happening in the chat. Welcome back, Kelon and Sharice. Both of you are back at the same time, so I think the conversation can continue. Kelon, you're on mute.
Yeah, just to add to what Sharice was saying there about making climate change relatable, as you say, a hot topic, or making it sexy, as they say. It's very difficult to do that, except because, again, climate change is for many people is this just very abstract and quote unquote invisible phenomenon, except if there is a disaster and people tell their stories about displacement, right? Or people tell their stories about how much crops they lost as a result of that, or how many, the body count, the death count. So it honestly comes down to people telling those human interest stories. In journalism, we call it human interest stories. You have to get to the people, excuse me, who can speak to these issues. I apologize. I'm having a sneezing spell.
Bless you.
Who can speak to these issues on an interpersonal level, but you also want to get stakeholders in your various communities, in your various constituencies, who are good messengers, who are good evangelizers of sharing those climate justice burdens that people listen to. Who are these people that people listen to? Is it the soca artist? Is it some popular culture influencer? Right? Some countries in the world, in the Maldives, for example, they are using influencers now to get the message out about the sinking atolls there, because the reality is we live in a very instant generation. I call it the popcorn internet generation, where everything is instant. People want to get information instant, and they use things like TikTok and Instagram, and in very bite-sized videos to get that. So we have to reimagine how we are messaging to people in the region, because using those new media tools that we have is an effective way of reaching younger generations so that they can get buy-in. But it's not only about how we reach them, it's about the way that we tell the stories. It's about how we tell the stories, what stories we tell. Now, a lot of people may not be aware of this, but one of the issues around climate change has to do with climate-induced human migration. Now, there is a crisis on the southern border here in the United States, but in the mid-90s, the people of the Pacific Islands, they made a proposal to the United Nations to consider them as the world's first climate refugees. Why did they make that ask back in the 90s? It's because their islands, given the trajectory of sea level rise, would become Atlantis. In other words, they would be underwater. And so these people, and I'm talking about close to 1 million people in a lot of these South Pacific atolls, they would no longer have a place to call home. So what happens then? They are considered climate refugees. So these people should be able to tell their stories, right? In ways in which the climate issues is affecting them. Yeah. We look at Haiti, for example. Why are people moving from Haiti? Yes, there is political instability there, but another reason why they're moving is because Haiti continues to experience a prolonged drought. And for many years, the type of slash and burn agriculture that was practiced in Haiti has resulted in a lot of barren land. So that when these major floods happen, it displaces millions of people in densely populated centers. Yeah. So it is important for these human interest narratives to percolate at the surface and become a mainstream narrative, because no one is going to be listening to a wonky scientist at an IPCC meeting. No one is going to be listening to a wonky scientist about what they're saying about parts per million or climate funding at the next climate summit that they're going to be having, where everyone is taking a plane and contributing to fossil fuels to then go and have a conversation about reducing fossil fuels. That does not make any sense to me. In a age when we have Zoom and we have Google Meets and we have all of these technologies. But yet we're going, and so, let us reduce this and that and the third. Quite frankly, I think that meeting should end, and the monies that we're putting into that annual meeting that we're having, we know the world is on a brink. We know what's happening. There is no need for us to go and lament the fact that it's happening. Let us use that money in investing in sustainable technologies. So let's use that money in investing in sustainable development. Let's use that money in investing in equitable infrastructure that would be able to cause people, especially on the margins of society, to be able to adapt to and mitigate against these negative climate impacts. These are the stories that need to be told at these climate summits. We already know that the science is already clear. The science is already clear. That the point is, we have to be able to determine how that science that is predicted and is unfolding is affecting everyday citizens, especially citizens at the margin.
Excellent. I have a question in the chat that I want to ask, but I want to give Sharice the chance to finish her thought. I don't know if you even remember, because one of the trainees in the chat say rainy season started 6 months too late in Trinidad and it's affecting your internet.
I'm looking at the rain. I don't know if you all can still hear me. I had to kind of change.
We can hear you.
Okay. One of the things that Kanan said, and looking at it from a disaster lens again, every risk that has existed to human welfare, social welfare, climate change is seen as a risk amplifier. It's seen as a vulnerability amplifier. So anything that has already existed to impact people's lives negatively, climate change is going to make it worse. So as you mentioned, Haiti has had a drought. That's going to, with raising temperatures, and that gets worse. Health impacts get worse. So it's something that, as you said, going to the meetings, I agree with you, especially knowing that there's an upcoming meeting. It does seem fairly an exercise in futility to have people travel, contributing to the emissions, to talk about the same thing, and hearing people who have gone to these events. The feedback is always, it's dominant from the global north. The global south does not get much say. There's very little we can do. I mean, in your region, you always hear about uniting to have a voice, which is why I think especially Mia Motley has really caught the world's attention, because she does speak on a region and speak in a type of urgency that has not been said previously. But whether or not that will actually result in what needs to be done for our region has yet to be seen. But it is something that it's not a fun situation to think about, but it is something that, what are the actual actions? The science has been known for a very long time. The science is, every year we get an IPCC report that basically confirms that the science has been known for a very long time. Yeah. And in fact, it may be actually a little bit worse than what we thought, and nothing is actually done. We're on track still for I think 1.5 by 2040. Which is not that far away. So, what is it that we're actually doing? And the thing is, in the Caribbean, there's not much we can do to mitigate. We have to adapt at this point, because as a region, we have not been the cause. So to say that we have a responsibility to mitigate and go to international discussions and where they talk about cutting emissions and signing treaties, that is not our priority at this point in time. Our priority is I'm seeing something, because it's not that we can't do much to mitigate. Let me clarify. The responsibility to mitigate on a global scale does not lie with the Caribbean. We can only mitigate so much to actually make an impact. At this point, the priority for us, for survival, lies with adaptation. Because, and that, again, looking at it from a disaster lens and a preparedness lens, yes, we have a responsibility to mitigate for the health of persons, but whether or not on a global scale it's going to make a big difference in the path that we're going down, I have yet to see, research to that effect.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank
And
you.
and just to add to that, it's also important to make the point that that there are so many climate treaties that are designed to help us to mitigate against these negative climate change impacts that we're seeing. But how many of these climate treaties are enforced? We have regulations, we have institutional frameworks within our own islands in the Caribbean to say that we should not encroach on wetlands, to say that we should not encroach on areas that are designated for environmental protection. And yet we go and we construct uh, monstrosities of hotels there, which is also an impact. So the question is, and this is why I take a dim view of the COP summits that they have, because from what I hear, a lot of these people, they go to these summits and what happens there, they have a couple toothless meetings in the morning, and then they go out on their shopping sprees. This year they're going to Dubai, so I can only imagine what will be happening there. I take a dim view of that, and as a critical scholar, we have to be able to critique these meetings, which are quite frankly just talk shops. These are just talk shops that are not engaging in any substantive and critical work. And the other point that we need to make is that we have to also think about in scholarship, in theory, there is a theory of political economy, and what political economy speaks to is corporate interest. What is the corporate interest? Nobody talks about the corporate interest and the for-profit motive around the climate crisis. The people who are responsible for the global emissions that we are seeing are fossil fuel corporations.
One of them is involved in COP this year. I think they're the head.
Absolutely. If we're not going to be tackling a serious reduction in by fossil fuel corporations, which, by the way, have a lot of power. They're very powerful organizations and institutions. And what my research found in the United States, in the state of Louisiana, in the area that is called Cancer Alley, is that you have two of the biggest oil corporations, BP and Exxon. They have these extractive industries in neighborhoods where people live, and they do not invest any iota in those communities. And these are some of the poorest communities in the United States that are experiencing the disproportionate burden of these climate impacts. So if we're going to be talking about wanting to reduce climate emissions, of wanting to have adaptive measures, of wanting to demand more from the global north in respect of climate finance, why are we not having a conversation about the people who continue to contribute to the emissions? It's not happening. It's just not happening.
Right. I want to go back to, I'm loving all of this. I really want us to remain here for the day. Let me just put that out there for everybody. But I want to take it back to the impacts. We've got a question here from Candice in the chat. So earlier on, Kanan, you spoke about the secondary and long-term impacts of climate change that we tend to overlook. Candice is asking about mental health concerns when various vulnerable communities suffer from water scarcity, limited health infrastructure, etc.
That's actually a very good question. And that mental health, in fact, it's funny the viewer mentioned this, because I actually am working on a paper right now, and the title of which is called Hurricane Trauma: Understanding the Mental Health Impacts of Hurricanes on Citizens of the Caribbean. And I would be looking specifically at the mental health trauma that came with Hurricanes Ivan and Emily in Grenada. For many Grenadians, that was an extremely traumatic event. So much so that people who were displaced from their homes had to migrate into other parts of the Caribbean where they were not familiar. That there is something jarring and jolting and something very discomforting of just having to leave the comfort of your own home and going into a hurricane shelter, for example, staying in at a hurricane shelter for sometimes weeks on end, not knowing where your next meal is going to come from. But for the displaced Grenadians after Hurricane Ivan in 2004, a lot of them had to go to other islands. Sure, people were happy to welcome them, but as Caribbean people, we tend to also have our sense of pride. You don't want to be treated as a sympathy case. In a stranger's house. So that mental health impact is real. And also what happened in Grenada after Hurricane Ivan, in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Ivan, they found that people who experienced a hurricane, there were several deaths, not as a result, not in the immediate aftermath of the hurricane, but I'm talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 months after. You had a slew of deaths of people of a certain age, between 70 and 85. But these people were able-bodied, healthy people. But because of that trauma that they witnessed in the hurricane, imagine working all of your life to build your house, enjoying your retirement, and this hurricane just comes overnight and just gets rid of everything. That is expected to have a trauma. And there is a correlation there between these disasters and that mental health trauma that people experience.
Yeah. I just want to jump in and say that, a lot of the time when we think about mental health and disasters, a lot of the time we think about, we're talking about sudden onset and slow onset. So we're thinking about trauma and we're thinking about immediately after an event. But what we're expected to see, at least regionally, or the context that we exist in, is multi-hazard, as in it's not just it's the amplification of already existing risks, but there's also the multiplication of different risks. So what tends to happen is, and this happened with St. Vincent and I think the volcano that erupted in the middle of a pandemic, it's trauma upon trauma upon trauma upon trauma. And they may not be severe traumas, but over time, it creates a mental health state that you see that people, they can't live in it anymore. So it's not like it's an incident that happened and they decided to flee. But over time, if you're living in an area, and I can speak for Trinidad, for example, where there are certain regions that flood consistently every year. And there are places that are now flooding. And after flood, after flood, after flood, that takes its toll on you to the point where you can expect it to be contributing to displacement. People are going to get fed up of this amount of trauma and this amount of mental strain, because even though it's not, post-traumatic stress that we're thinking of, there is this weight on you every year when it rains. Is my house going to flood? Am I going to have to flee? Am I going to have to? And eventually people are going to leave. And it's something that is a consideration when you look at climate mobility and climate displacement, that it's not just from the impact of an event, but over time, does it make sense? Is my place of residence still giving me the quality of life? Is it giving me the mental quality of life that I want and require? And you will see able-bodied people who are able to leave because of the stresses that come over time. So it is a consideration as well, that it's not always the sudden events, but there's also slow onset mental health issues that we expect to happen as well. So just to kind of contribute to what Kanan was saying, that is also a mental health consideration, that it comes over time.
Excellent. All right. Do we have any questions from the audience? I made a lot of notes. I have migration as adaptation. I have do we have regulations in place to ensure that we are properly adapting and mitigating? I have climate change and the long-term impacts, and it impacts every sector of the economy, and that we should be using personal real-life experience in order to communicate the climate change message. So many things, so many questions, but I want to give our audience an opportunity to ask questions should they have any. I know earlier I saw a hand go up, but I'm not saying that again. So if it is that person still want to ask the question, it is your time now. I simply ask that you put your camera on when it is that you are speaking, so we can put a face to the voice. So the floor is open. Okay. So while our audience get their thoughts together, I want to ask Kelon, I think. Okay, James, your hand is up. You can go ahead.
He needs to unmute there.
Good, thanks.
There we
Well,
go.
good morning, everyone. I've been listening with interest to the conversation, and I'm gonna have to leave in a little while to go pick up my daughter who's at a medical appointment. So, Chriselle, I can't spend the whole day, much as I would like to. This is an important discussion. I think Callon's point about relatability in stories is important, and I think relating it to people's health is one way to make it relatable because carbon dioxide levels are abstract, and the
Yeah.
North Pole melting is abstract. Last week, I was talking to medical students in Bahamas. I was teaching, and I said, "How many people planning to take a mortgage?" And about a third of the class put up their hand virtually. Say, "Yeah, I said, "Where are you taking the mortgage?" So I said, "Think about that." And I'm coming back and a bit later on. And a bit later on, I showed a map of what will happen in 2050 with sea level rise in the Bahamas. Anybody on the call from Bahamas?
Somebody just left from Bahamas,
I,
actually.
I think so.
My point is, if you live in the Bahamas, if you live in Caroni or the Riva Mayaro in Trinidad,
Yeah.
parts of Jamaica, Cayman Islands, parts of Belize, parts of Guyana, take care where you take that mortgage, because by the time the mortgage finishes in 25 years' time, your house may have no value, or it might be very regularly flooded. That's an example of, I think, something that's relatable. It's long term, but if you're taking a mortgage, you're thinking long term, or you should be. I think health is another one. The current heat that we've been having, showing folks, I was in Diamond Vale helping my brother do his house a couple of weeks ago. It was in the afternoon. Temperature was 33 degrees, and I felt I was gonna die. It was so hot. I was just sweating. And then I went and I looked at the humidity. So it's not only the actual temperature, it's the heat index, the combination of heat and humidity. And that said it was 51. It was 85% humidity and 33 degrees Celsius. So we have to be aware of that as well and show how that with increasing heat comes increasing. As climate advances, we're getting more hotter, more humid weather, and there the danger for the older folks, very young children, pregnant women, and so on. And that may mean you need more heat breaks, you need more water breaks, you need to be able to get shade, you need to, have time out when you do those kinds of jobs. So I think food prices. So I will shut up because I see somebody else wants to talk. Well, I have two more things to say. One is we should all be planting trees for food. Plant mango, plant piwa, plant avocado, plant breadfruit. We really have to do that because a global famine is coming.
Mhm.
If you look at what is happening with climate change and the impact simultaneously in North America, which is one of the bread baskets, Europe and China, when that happens, we real monkey pants. Or you could use a more stark phrase, but it wouldn't be appropriate to do it, about a creek and a paddle.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things we should be promoting. Both of, we have a serious problem, but one of the things we have to do is to grow more of our own food. And then the last thing I'll hit on is I am fed up of us saying, "Oh, the others making a bigger problem. When they do something, we will do something on our side to fix it." Because we are part of the problem, ladies and gentlemen. And I put in the chat, who making our cars, who making our food, who making our clothes? Is there people who burning all this carbon on our behalf? The per capita footprint of Trinidad and Tobago is twice that of the United States. The per capita footprint of carbon for Bahamas is about 9 or 10. US is at 12. And that doesn't count the tourists who are coming to visit us. Secondly, the mitigation actions that you need to take to eat more plant-based diet, to drive less and walk and ride. These have health benefits. So that's a good reason for adopting mitigation measures. Third, when you sit down to negotiate, you're in a much better position when you can say, we are doing all for our countries to conserve the environment and to mitigate climate change. Somebody said earlier, and I agree with them, we are not respecting our forests. We are not respecting our mangroves. When we do that, seriously, then we could talk. You know, Trinidad is a member of AOSIS, but they don't want any talk of phasing out fossil fuels. Prime Minister come back from COP26 and he said, this is a real problem. This is real and it's caused by greenhouse gases. Trinidad and Tobago is part of the problem. We have to change. And then he said, we're still selling oil and gas as long as people buy it. So if we're serious, we have to do some introspection and we have to write some things that are not going to be popular.
Yeah. Oh. Can I jump in? Sorry. No, thank you, Jay. Because I mean, I was reading your comments in each chat, and I agree with you. We do have a responsibility, especially when you look at like our supply chains and where we get there is a responsibility there. And I said, let me give some more context to my comment versus mitigation and adaptation. We're coming from the, I guess, sphere of disasters and preparedness and management. I think I'm coming from a place of there's a limited amount of resources available to our region. And while both those are important aspects, mitigation and adapting, looking at the reality of what resources exist to the region and are easily accessible in the current frame, my comment was to say that the priority at this point, given the urgency of the science for our region, should really be focused on adaptation. It's not to say there's no responsibility for mitigation, yes, but I think the context that I'm speaking from is in a place of limited resources. That at this point in time, when we're talking about global boiling and you see the language changing into more urgency, what is it that realistically do we need to focus on as a region? Because yes, we have a per capita rate that is higher than other countries, but the net impact of our region is still objectively lower than other regions. And it's not to say that because they did it, we should do it. No, it's just the reality of lack of resources and lack of funding, priority-wise, it would make a little more sense for us to focus on the adaptation than really stretch ourselves with the mitigation, not to say that it's unimportant. And it kind of brings me back to some arguments that I hear about, and I'm trying to frame it in a way that makes sense, but giving people reusable bags when you have industries churning out tons and tons and tons and not doing anything. We can't use a reusable bag enough. The everyday person cannot fix this problem. So in that analogy, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase it, but I think you understand where I'm trying to go. That there's a responsibility, yes, but at the end of the day, when there's a limited resource around and we have to do something urgently, to survive based on the science, adaptation is where we need to be focusing our energies.
Well, I only partly agree with you.
That's fine. That's fine. That's what it's for.
If you look at Matthew 7:3 and Luke 6:41, Matthew 7:3 and Luke 6:41, look it up. We're very good at pointing out the fault in other people when we have big faults in ourselves.
We have a board in our own eye. I understand.
No, I agree with you. We do need, and it's unjust that we don't have access to resources based on vulnerability. Because even though we are part of the problem, and even though we have a high per capita income in some of our countries, we are extremely vulnerable. 9 of the 10 worst disasters in the last 15, 20 years, UNDDR 2020 publication, has been in our Caribbean small island states on a per capita GDP basis. So people borrow to finance the reconstruction, they get hit again because the thing is unrelenting. Now they borrow some more and you're up to here in debt. That is not fair. That is not just. So we should definitely be tackling that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we shouldn't spend money on adaptation. We should. We need to. Because the flooding, the sea level rise, the hurricanes that we're seeing, the heat waves that are coming, you know, this is killing us. So we need to. But we also need to mitigate. And a public health person, I'll say one and then shut up. Mitigation has so many health benefits.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So many health, and doing that in and of itself. A more plant-based diet, less cars and less pollution, so air cleaner, so children have less asthma.
Yeah.
These are very concrete benefits to mitigation.
And you know what's interesting? Sorry, I was talking to somebody yesterday about this. I said, looking at the angle in that way, I feel like as we're talking about messaging and how to frame these things, that to me has not been pushed enough. that the mitigation side of it, it's like that joke, what if we clean up the earth and it doesn't do anything? You've cleaned up the earth. Like there's no bad part. For example, so you want to put, I worked in environmental regulation, and I remember having this argument with industries where they're like, there are much bigger industries next door. Why do I need to put a cap on mine? And it's like, because you have a community next door that has disease. It's like you're not cleaning up at a certain point, you're not cleaning up your act for the global impact. You're cleaning it up for the local impact. However, on a global scale, I do agree with what Ryan asked you, put in the chat, that on a global scale, we're very small players. However, we do live in this environment. Therefore, doing the mitigation should be for our local benefit. But thinking that it's going to have a huge global impact and the responsibility lies on our region, I think is a bit of a misframe. So to me, do it because it's good for us, but also at the same time understand that we are not the ones who have the major responsibility, and therefore we should be adapting because we're going to be feeling the impacts based on the science. So I think we agree in different angles. But I do think the messaging does need to change to the local impacts that we're feeling and what mitigation would do to improve that. I mean, and again, you said you come from public health, that makes sense. That is obviously the angle that we should be taking, but on a global scale, I don't think that's what's been done. So that's an interesting.
When you look at our epidemic of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, we need to take actions to mitigate climate change because those actions have health benefits. Ryan, I'm going to take you for a beer and we'll have a big argument about this.
I mean, down to the flooding and traffic, and everything is so interrelated. Flooding causes hours and hours of traffic. Traffic leads to mental health issues. People don't get home in time to cook healthy food. It all has these impacts. So yes, they're huge impacts, the things that we should be addressing through a climate change lens because it has impact everywhere. So yeah, I think we agree.
Okay, and before you get the chance to disagree,
let Andrea talk.
We have some hands up. Let's go with Andrea. Andrea, you're up.
Good morning. Are you hearing me clearly?
Yes, we are.
My camera is not working, but I hope my picture could suffice.
We'll accept
I
that.
think James brought a lot of perspectives that I would have raised in the chat, but I'm coming from a mental health perspective. I'm a psychologist working in Simmons and the Grenadines, and I was a part of the psychosocial team at the volcanic response. But an observation I have because as a practitioner, I receive a lot of the climate anxiety information from clients, and I see a lot of the responses. So James is talking about the public health and the health aspect, but a lot of the conversations don't take into account the mental health aspect because we only look at mental health as disorders, so the anxiety. And what I think I want to advocate more than just ask a question is for all scientists and practitioners to examine how the communication is actually impacting mental health on a wider scale. Because a lot of the times your conversation creates resistance rather than creates empowerment and movement. So I made a statement about our accountability. The truth is a lot of the climate change conversation has a lot of funding that the Caribbean benefit from that we don't speak about. And there's a lack of accountability in terms of empowering our people to see what we can do to adapt. So, for example, in terms of the volcanic eruption, nobody is taken into account in policy to make volcanic proof homes so that people can have more resilient homes. We're more focusing on hurricane, and a lot of our policy is outdated, and we don't realize how our Caribbean people are fully westernized, where our indigenous cultures actually looked at taking care of the environment and looked at plant-based diets, and that is a part of our mental health and our identity. So in terms of the conversation, yes, the bigger countries do fund a lot of things and do have a lot of manufacturing responses, but is our science based on what's happening in the Caribbean? Is the conversation, is the communication taken into account how our brain thinks? If you flood people with information that traumatizes them, they will not listen. They will just go about their daily activities and do what works for them. So even though we're talking, and I used to live in Trinidad before moving to Simmons, and The traffic, you have to leave home 5 o'clock in the morning to reach the Port of Spain for 8 o'clock. That impacts on health and sleep. And we're not taking that into account even in our distribution of goods and resources in terms of where we know Caroni floods for a long time. For years, you've been hearing about that. And still the monies are going into other things instead of being distributed. So yes, we are vulnerable, but are we creating our own vulnerability through our conversation? And just as we like to do as Caribbean people, talk a lot and little is implemented. And that is also focusing into our learned helplessness as a Caribbean people. Because we focus on tourism, Dominica focuses on ecotourism, where they're sustaining and preserving their indigenous people and their culture. But a lot of our Caribbean countries are Americanized. Take for example the bigger islands. There are lots of Americanized products and systems and thinking, and that is also impacting the climate change conversation. And climate anxiety is real. A lot of women do not want to have children because of the impacts. We do not want to focus on it because what has happened is, I think the traumas of these science have dulled our listening to it. And my question is how much are you really investing in the mental health aspect of it on a wider scale rather than a response? James talked about mitigation, but are we paying attention to resistance theories? Are we paying attention to social psychology and how humans interact? Are we paying attention to our messaging? And I think that is also another part of the climate change and the mental health that needs to be focused on. So yes, the trauma is there, but when we talk about trauma-informed practices, it looks at risk, it looks at reduction, it looks at assessment, it's continuously evaluating how human being behaves, rather than just focusing on the changes of the environment. We need to focus on behavior as well. So
Yeah.
that's my input.
Yeah.
Very nice.
No, just if I could just jump in, sorry. I loved that perspective, and I really did. There was something that Andrea mentioned about the funding and the availability of funding for climate change, and I just wanted to draw attention to some discussions that I guess have been happening recently. I know UNDRR had a couple of workshops recently and one of the things that came out of these discussions were that there's climate financing available, there's climate adaptation financing, and then there's disaster risk financing. But a lot of the times the two are not seen as interrelated. And there's research into why that is. And how can you make areas more ready to access that funding? Because she's right, there is a lot of funding available for that people can access for climate adaptation, for disaster risk, and for the region. The issue is the readiness to actually access it, the accountability. And a lot of the times what ends up happening with that funding is because the facilities that need it to do preparedness and to do anticipatory actions end up not being ready to do it. We're being outpaced by incidents that keep happening, and those funds end up being used for recovery. And it's something that James would have mentioned as well, as we're recovering from one and the next one comes, we're recovering from one. So it has to be done all at the same time, that, you're also recovering, but that whole build back better. How do you build back in a better way to be able to access the funds that exist? Because they do exist. The problem is it's the accessibility seems to be a big issue. And I really liked Andrea's, the word climate anxiety was what was escaping me previously when I was talking about that consistent mental health issues that comes. I'm very glad that you mentioned it, because I was like, thank you, that's the term that's used. And I really appreciated the take on it. So thanks, Andrea.
Thank you. Thank you. So we have Katrina. She has a question, but before Katrina comes on, I noticed that some people are mentioning that they need to leave and James need to leave. So can I ask a very small favor of everybody, that you can put on your camera and we can get a screenshot just so that we know that we were all here. If there's no picture, then it didn't happen. So put your camera on, everybody. Put your camera on and let us take a picture. Dezan will take a screenshot. So Dezan, you'll tell us when to smile and when the picture is taken.
Sure. So I'll just wait for people to put on their video. I'm hoping we get a couple more people putting on their video. Like, don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Okay, design, I think that's all we're gonna get.
All right, so what I will do is sort of like spotlight people who have their video on. All right. Okay, so on the count of on the count of 3. Oh, my video is off. All right. Hi, everyone. Okay, so on the count of 3, I'm gonna go 1, 2, 3. Just give us a smile. One more time. 1, 2, 3, smile. All right, thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay, so I'm seeing that Katrina says she has to leave, but she's been very active in the chat. So maybe I'll just let me read a couple of her comments. So in case anybody wasn't paying attention to the chat, so if it is that you want to respond to anything that Katrina has said, because she said she needed to leave. So she said, I think that we need to have a common mindset and stop focusing on adaptation only. We need to have a systematic approach. We can't be trying to do only one thing at one point. Only one thing at this point. We have enough capacity to have actions happening in 3 major strategies for adaptation, mitigation, and action for climate empowerment at the same time. She also said that we are heading into survival mode, and without an overarching strategy, we will have to leave some people behind, or some people are left behind. She also said that she advocate or try to for the traditional technologies and mindset of the indigenous people. If we don't use the income from both local and international oil and gas and industrial companies in the country towards a just transition, we can't be exemplary country or region in the climate sustainability environment space. So that was some of Katrina's points. One more thing she said, NGOs need to be given equal space. We are often politely smiled at and ignored. Anybody want to pick up, comment on anything that Katrina said?
I see Ryan's hand is up.
And Ryan hand is up, so then we'll go to Ryan.
So, climate change is intersectional. It's just not one disaster or a heat, or rising sea levels. It's extremely multifaceted and interconnected, right? Andrea so perfectly articulated what happens in Trinidad and Tobago in respect of traffic there. I mean, I've experienced the traffic on, they call it the Beatum, the Beatum, on one of those rush hour mornings, because I have cousins over in St. Joseph. And getting to Port of Spain was just a nightmare in the rain. And, you see all of that flood water that comes as a result of that. And when we also have to think about structural systems, what structural mechanisms do we have in place outside of, we talk about the disaster management structure, we talk about that capacity, but what other structures do we have in other facets of socioeconomic life that are there to be able to assist us with adapting to and mitigating against these climate challenges? The infrastructure is simply not there, and that's one of the things that we need to think about in respect of these COP summits. Yes, you're thinking about climate finance and ensuring that we meet these, that we get funding within that particular climate finance structure. But if we do not have the capacity and the infrastructure to be able to mitigate against these climate challenges, then we're really wasting time. So capacity building has to be so critical, and capacity building has to move beyond the ministries of climate resilience that we have in governments, or some think tank on climate resilience. There has to be some kind of climate resilience structure in all facets of government, in all facets of life, so that we can mitigate, especially within the context of our health systems. Somebody mentioned schools. In the heat, I just can't imagine. I mean, going to school in Grenada, in high school, we never had there was no such thing as an air conditioning.
No.
You only had fans. But right now with this heat, I just can't imagine what learning is like for educators and students in that environment. It has to be oppressive.
Yeah.
So we have to think about structures beyond just what happens narrowly within the ministries of climate resilience, but their work has to be a multi-pronged approach in many respects.
I also wanted to just jump in there and also respond to Katrina a bit, I think, saying that, yes, we have the ability to do all things at once. One of the things that I think is consistently advocated for is we can do all things at once. However, that means that you're going to have these concerns streamlined into legislation, into all the ministries, like planning cannot be separate and apart from disaster risk reduction. Climate change needs to be a part of overall planning policy. It needs to be a consideration, and that is how you do all things at once. Because when you're talking about this siloed approach to response, and then there's environment, but then as you said, the Ministry of Education should also have capacity on climate change adaptation. So that is how you address all things at once. It's possible, but it means that there needs to be a level of integration of these topics into I'm trying to think of the word, not just legislation, but into policies at a higher level. It has to be mainstreamed, correct?
Yeah.
So I agree, it's fully possible. It's just we need to have some sort of buy-in and understanding that it needs to be done urgently, so that it's not just siloed into a Ministry of Environment or a Ministry of Civil Protection. It needs to be in all of the aspects of planning, because it's going to affect all of the aspects of our existence. And also, I see there was a discussion in the chat, about funding. Just wanted to throw out there, because I wanted to mention it earlier, because there was a discussion about what funding and sources exist, and James would have responded saying that there's more funding coming on stream. And yes, there is a lot of funding coming on stream, and a lot of them are building up. How do you get the readiness of these countries and facilities to actually access the funding? But I also wanted to throw out the Bridgetown Initiative, because I was supposed to mention it earlier, which is basically a restructuring of how financing is done, or proposed restructuring, so that countries would really have access or be able to focus on these, adaptation, mitigation, all the things that need to be done without the looming threat of having to pay back debts after disasters. So it would be like a pause on debt. So there are discussions changing now into, okay, considering that there are resource limitations, what do people do? How do we get countries to actually be able to use the funding in a way that makes sense? Because it doesn't make sense to keep providing funding, keep giving access to funding, and then a storm comes in and all the good work is done. So the Bridgetown Initiative is interesting in a way, because it's talking about pausing debts, allowing countries to really have time to recover and build back better, so that that development is not outpaced by consistent and more frequent incidents that we expect to be happening in climate change.
Okay, thank you. I am having so much fun, but none of you gave me the authority to go on for the entire day. So we need to start wrapping up. I know Ryan, I saw your hand, but are you still there? Do you still have a question? Because it disappeared. Okay, so no Ryan. All right. So if Ryan doesn't have a question anymore, it's time for us to wrap up. I want to start doing that with Kanan. So Kanan, Climate Tracker, what we do is basically empower journalists, and that's climate journalists, so that they can get the climate word out there, the education, the advocacy, justice, right? And we have our fellows. I think we have some on now. I think I saw Candice for sure. I'm not certain who else is on here. Oh, I think I saw Marco come on. So our fellows, they are trained. They do their stories, the podcast focusing on climate justice issues. We've had some amazing topics. One of them, I think, that's getting a lot of love is climate change and breastfeeding. Yeah, because again, yes, Sharice, I saw that exactly. Everybody looked that way when we mentioned breastfeeding is carbon neutral and what is the link between climate change and breastfeeding. We've had people speaking about loss and damage and all of these things. All the things. Woohoo, that's a story I did. Yes, Candice, it was yours. Excellent, right? And Kellan made the point that climate change affects every sector. We've got the farmers, you spoke about the farmers, the people that work outside, marine, again, breastfeeding, and we do not hear those conversations happening. So Kellan, from a climate communication, health communication standpoint, I want you to speak to our fellows who are not here. They're going to see the recording. Speak to our fellows from that standpoint. How do we incorporate all of these things into the stories, human interest, and all of the things that we want people to know? How do we get them to advocate and to act?
Yeah, so it honestly comes down to thinking outside of the journalistic box. I mean, as journalists, we are empowered to turn a stone into a news story. It's like, it's like the biblical fable of turning water into wine, or making blood out of stone, or stone out of blood, right? It honestly comes down to being much more resourceful and being much more creative in respect of how we are telling those stories. Yeah. You want to be able to find, in respect of everything that we have been talking about, we have to try and get away from just reporting on what is happening at the COP summit. It's very wonky. We know what happens there. People don't honestly pay attention to what someone is saying at these COP summits. What people would be more interested in, though, is how are these climate change impacts affecting everyday people who they can relate to? How does it affect your teachers in school? How does it affect somebody who was displaced? So do we have people who are displaced as a result of a hurricane who is no longer living where they're originally from, but are living in another island? How are they picking their lives up and trying to move on from that particular disaster? How are public health facilities in the Caribbean dealing with the heat impacts that we're seeing? A lot of our health centers are not air conditioned in the Caribbean. Yeah, what happens there? So as climate journalists, you ought to be empowered with the ability to find those stories that people can relate to. And in that way, you're then able to create an impact in which people will begin to listen to these stories. Yep. There is also a lot of conversation happened here around climate finance as well. There is also, and I hope that Climate Tracker is doing that, being able to seek funding for telling those stories, right? Because we know that in the context of media, a lot of the mainstream media institutions in the Caribbean, sadly, they do not see climate change stories as a topic that can generate great leads. In journalism, there is a terminology that says, if it bleeds, it leads. So if there is a trapping incident, if there is a murder incident, if there is some kind of salacious scandal about who's sleeping with who and who horning who or whatever else, that is what the media is going to lead with. They're not going to lead with, Mary down the street, she was displaced because the river came up and flooded her nice garden that she was tilling for years. It's now gone, right? They're not going to lead with that. So mainstream institutions would not do that. So your challenge, you have the tools now. You have these new media tools now that gives you the ability to not have to depend or be unburdened by a gatekeeper, be unburdened by a news director whose thinking around climate is different, you know. So that is what needs to happen, and you need to find that funding. You need to be able to be resilient in respect of how you tell those stories, so that people can begin to pay attention to it.
All right.
Yeah.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Sharice, you're smiling because you know I'm coming to you. You're muted.
I was taking some notes when Kanan was talking, because it's something that is very, very important when you come to communication. Like, we know how to communicate a story to sell.
Yeah.
Not, people know, journalists know how to make things, we don't use even sexy when it comes to crises, but they know how to make things understandable and relatable. The problem is, I think for too long, these issues have been siloed to scientists. So scientists feel like they're screaming into a void, because it's like, I've been telling you for years that the sea level rise, and it's just not, there's a disconnect. And this is what I like. I like climate trackers, and I like what Kanan said about using the tools, use the media tools that exist, but just change the subject to this. Like, the tools already exist, the avenues already exist. We already know how to make a story sellable. It's just the subject itself is now going to change. And for far too long, the story of climate change and disasters and what that's going to do has been left in the hands of scientists to tell, when it should be left in the hands of the storytellers to tell.
Yeah.
It should be left in the hands of people who know how to tell a story and know how to sell a story. So I think it's changing now, and it's moving in that way, and you'll see positive growth in getting people on board. But I think that's what's been happening, and that has led to frustration, where, as you know, we said people have been saying this since the 90s. This is not new. We've known this is happening. It's just it's not been sold in a way that people can relate to, and that's really where it needs to go in order to make that change now.
Regarding the storytelling, maybe today Congo Tay will tell
Yes.
the climate
I was supposed
story.
to saw that in the chat.
It
I wanted to put a
is.
plug for that.
Yes.
I
So-
had no, because I had a conversation about this, and it sounds very, very interesting from
It
what
does
I've
sound interesting,
yeah.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
So it is supposed to be. Ryan, you want to tell us about that before we wind down? I have one last question for Sharice while we close, but Ryan, you can tell us about a little bit about that. Is Ryan still here?
I am. I'm just on the move. Apologies for that. So today Congo Tay, that is a climate justice micro theater festival that is being put on by the Cropper Foundation, and is sponsored by Open Societies Foundation. And what they've done is something really, really incredible. They've gone to different communities in Trinidad and Tobago, communities that aren't Port of Spain, that aren't San Fernando. We're in places like Labre, Brazil, Williamsville, Vecini, and they talk to the people on the ground about how they are dealing with climate change, how it has affected them, how has the environment changed, how has industry changed their community. And then they took that information and they created 9 different plays inspired by those stories. So at the festival, if you attend, the attendance to the festival is free. You could just go to the festival, all right? But then you could buy a ticket to go and see these plays when you're inside of there. And they're really, really great. They're 15-minute plays. They're small, so you could probably see about 6 plays while you're there. And outside of the play, there would also be comedy. There's midnight robbers. There's interactive arts displays around climate change. So it's really a very cool thing to experience. There is a show this Saturday, and I do highly encourage anyone who's interested in climate justice, interested in hearing the stories of our people put forward in these artistic ways, to come out and attend and support. Thanks.
Excellent, lovely. So now we're seeing climate change, the communication for climate change it's happening from the comedic side of things, and I think it's reaching a different audience. The people who would usually listen to the BBC News and the CNN News, now they probably wouldn't bother or be very much interested in the comedic side of things, but we do know that there are people who would love to see that, and they obviously can relate to it from that standpoint. So I think that is another thing that we need to look at in terms of climate change communication, using the different means that are available. So final question for you, Sharice, as we wrap up. I'm gonna piggyback on Katrina's point about the three things that we can do: mitigate, adapt, and act, right? From an emergency disaster management point of view, what do you have to say on that? What is your final words for us from that standpoint?
I think we spoke about the mitigation and adaptation, and I think one of the things that I probably should have plugged for the action is something that we mentioned earlier, that when we say act, there's usually a bit of we feel like there's hesitation. Okay, well, we know this information. What do we do now? How do we act? And I just wanted to kind of throw in there that it's been mentioned before that Indigenous populations, communities usually know how to act, or they have known how to act in the past as well. It's a matter of respecting that and incorporating that information. One of the things that I have been working on for a while now has been early warning systems. And a major part of early warning systems when it comes to emergencies and disasters is how do you incorporate Indigenous knowledge that has existed for centuries to actually bridge that gap between the forecasting of an incident. You know it's coming, you know what it's going to do. How do we get people to act on it? And that's the response capacity of a area. So I think to bridge that gap to act, I think we really do have to kind of look back to see what was done in the past, what we know has worked in the past. On a smaller scale, it may need to be ramped up, but throwing out the baby with the bathwater and saying, well, let's do new innovative ways of responding when old ways have worked, they just need to be scaled up, is something that I think we're very notorious for doing in the Caribbean, basically trying to innovate and not realize that we've had the knowledge all along. So, I mean, I just wanted to end on that. I mean, I don't know if it addresses everything Katrina said because she had some good comments, but I did want to say that it's not impossible to act on the knowledge. It's been done before. There are examples of it being done successfully. It's just a matter of streamlining it and making people more aware of what to do. And that's...
Oh, I mean, is there a better note to end? You already know I don't want to end. I said this from the very beginning, but unfortunately, time flies so fast when you're having fun. It has been an absolute pleasure sitting here listening to you. My brain is full. I'm just here and I'm like, ooh, okay, now I need to think about this. Now I need to think about this. It has been an amazing experience. I knew that we had two excellent subject matter experts. Yes, Shirin, this one is for you. I am very, 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 very thankful to both of you for accepting our invitation, for being on here today. Kellan had me worried for a little bit. He said he had midterms, but I was like, Kellan, are you letting me down? But you did not. You're mute again.
I tend to follow through, yes.
Yeah. So I am thankful to you on behalf of the entire Climate Tracker team. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you to our audience. Thank you for all your questions. A reminder that we are on every social media, well, maybe not every, but we're definitely on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn. So you can follow us. You can learn more about our work, what we do. We have a website also, climatetracker.org. You can check out our fellow stories. We have some things coming up, and we have some fellows going to COP. I know Kellan may not like to hear that very much, but it's one of the things that happened.
It's not so much about the fellows. It's more about the policymakers.
I know it's about
the policymakers who fly on their private jets.
Okay, well, this one will not be private. I can assure you. Right, Design? It's not private jets, right?
Oh yeah, we have not reached that level of
Right.
affordability.
And that's the issue I have. It's just, these people who go there on their private jets when they could have, gotten on a commercial flight like everybody else, right? But you're on a private jet with, that's just a waste of time.
So they are all gonna be flying commercial, and it is Climate Tracker across the entire. It's the international Climate Tracker because we have the Africa and Asian team. So again, thank you to everybody, audience and guests alike, and I look forward to working with you again in the future. It has been an amazing experience. Have a good day, everybody. Even though I really wish we were staying here for the day.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you, everybody.
Take
Bye.
care.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you again. Bye-bye.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.